Experts on homelessness gathered in Winnipeg today with an eye to collecting data to try and get a more detailed picture of the ongoing issue. Jason Whitford is with Indigenous-led End Homelessness Winnipeg. He says federal government failures to ensure basic necessities like housing and clean drinking water on First Nations contributes to the growing number of homeless people in Winnipeg.
That's where it all starts. I think families starting off, going to school, the health issues, like everything. Housing is fundamental to just living a good life and having access to your basic needs.
Most of the nation's Indigenous housing experts are gathered here in Winnipeg this week to try to hammer out solutions. Margaret Froh is the CEO at the Aboriginal Housing Management Association in Vancouver, BC. She joins us now in studio. Margaret, great to have you with us here in studio. I guess first off, can you just tell us about the Indigenous Housing Coalition and why it's important to have Indigenous-led solutions?
Yeah, thank you. The National Indigenous Collaborative Housing Incorporated is actually a coalition of members across Canada who have been fighting the good fight on the ground, some of them for nearly 50 plus years on the urban Indigenous housing and homelessness front. And when the federal government got out of housing in the early 1990s, the most impacted communities were often the most marginalized and the vulnerable, especially our urban Indigenous populations. Our missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls are two-spirited. And so we've been really fighting over the last 20 plus years since the federal government got out of the housing game to stay ahead of the escalating crisis that we're all seeing in our backyards today. And when the Liberal government created the National Housing Strategy in 2018, missing from that was anything to do with the Indigenous housing crisis. And so many of us as urban Indigenous housing leaders felt that we needed to take a leadership role and start to lobby government for meaningful inclusion in the National Housing Strategy. So the fight's actually decades old, but the National Indigenous Collaborative Housing Incorporated, NISHI, came together officially in November of 2022. We pulled together national urban Indigenous housing and support leaders from across the country. And we missed a few communities just because we were struggling to try to pull together as many people as we could to form a national coalition to insist to government that they need to invest meaningfully in Indigenous communities. So we came together on November 25th. There were about 20 of us across Canada. We signed a declaration. We issued that declaration to the Ministry of Indigenous Services Canada and to Minister Hassan's office and to the Prime Minister's office, asserting our rights to self-determination as it relates to the lack of affordable housing for urban Indigenous peoples. We were incorporated on December 21st, 2022, and we have pushed the federal government to allocate the 2022 $300 million that was in budget 2022 for urban Indigenous housing to actually flow through our new national organization. What we've learned is that for government, by government models of housing really doesn't have the kind of impact that our community needs as Indigenous peoples. What we've learned in the 50 plus years of work that we've been doing on the ground is that Indigenous people need solutions that are led by Indigenous peoples. People that have lived the life of being marginalized, people that have lived the life of understanding what it's like to have to fight the systems of oppression that have been in place since colonization. And so we've urged the federal government to allocate that $300 million to NISHI. And then we subsequently insisted that the Prime Minister adhere to his own council's advice to utilize the $6.3 billion a year, so $62 billion plus, over the next 10 years as a minimum investment in staving off the ongoing crisis for housing and homelessness for Indigenous peoples.
Margaret, lots there. As we've seen in the news in recent weeks, Vancouver police have been clearing out tent cities. We've seen this not just only in Vancouver, but other places as well. What would an Indigenous approach to that situation do differently?
Yeah, we've been working with the province of BC for many years now. In fact, the province of BC has been a strong partner of our provincial organization in British Columbia, urging them to understand that where a population has an overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples, that they need to have solutions that are driven by Indigenous peoples. The province on the surface and many municipalities seem to have a genuine interest in attempting to adhere to those models, but what often happens in all levels of government is that they fall back to the status quo. They need to keep the most, I don't know how to frame this, I guess. They need to adhere to the people that they think are going to vote for them, and that's often the business communities, it's often the investment communities, and they don't want to see the homelessness encampments or the urban villages, as we like to call them. They don't want to see those on their streets, and so in downtown Eastside, the government, local government, and the provincial government decided that they needed to decamp the residents that were living there. We had wished that they had included our urban Indigenous leadership and local nations leadership in that process, because there's a legacy of trauma that urban Indigenous people have been enduring, and they deserve a humane approach to addressing why they're on the streets, and they deserve to be included in the solutions to pathways out of that homelessness.
Margaret, unfortunately, we'll have to leave it there, but appreciate you taking some time. Good luck with the conference this week.
Thank you so much.